The night Owen got that call, he realized that the people who matter most are the ones who quietly hand you their whole life without making a speech about it. His name was Owen Calloway, 38 years old. He did furniture restoration out of a converted garage on the east side of town. The kind of work that left cedar dust in his collar and wood stain on the back of his hands no matter how long he scrubbed. He had been divorced for 2 years from a woman named Claire, who had married him for the version of himself she imagined, and quietly resented the one that actually showed up. The split had been civil, which somehow made it worse. They signed the papers on a Thursday, and he was back in the garage by Friday afternoon, sanding the legs of a Victorian writing desk like nothing had happened. He wasn't bitter, just quiet in a way that took up more space than it used to. His best friend was Nadia Ose. She had been his best friend since they were 24 and working at the same hardware distribution company, her in accounts, him on the floor. She was 40 now, though she didn't carry it the way most people do. She wore it like a comfortable coat, effortlessly, with the collar turned up. She was warm and precise in the way of someone who had learned to measure things twice before cutting, and her laugh was the kind that made strangers at restaurant tables turn their heads. She had been through a broken engagement 3 years prior, a man named Patrick who used the word investment too often and meant it about everything, including her, and she had come out the other side quieter but not smaller. Owen had watched it happen. He had been the one she called from the parking lot of the venue when she ended it. He had driven 40 minutes in the rain to sit with her in a diner booth while she ate a piece of pecan pie and didn't cry once, which he privately thought was one of the bravest things he had ever seen. They talked 3 or 4 times a week. They had lunch on alternating Tuesdays. He had fixed the warped door on her kitchen cabinet once, and she had made him stay for dinner as payment, which he accepted because her chicken stew was, without qualification, the best thing he had eaten in 2 years of his own cooking. He knew her coffee order. She knew which rib of his garage roof started to leak when rain came in from the northeast. He was, without either of them ever naming it, a fixture in her life. She was the same in his. It had always been easy between them in the way that easy things are easy, so naturally that you stop noticing them, the way you stop noticing the sound of rain once it has been falling long enough. It was a Tuesday in November when the call came. Owen was in the garage, halfway through leveling the stretcher on a shaker-style chair, the lamp throwing a warm wedge of light across the concrete floor and the smell of linseed oil sitting heavy in the cold air. His phone buzzed against the workbench. The number was a hospital on the north side of the city. He had no one admitted there that he knew of. He answered anyway. The nurse on the line was patient and clear. Nadia Ose had been brought in that afternoon. A car had run a red light on Westmore Avenue and caught the driver's side of hers. She was stable. That word first, stable. The nurse said it the way people say it when they want you to keep breathing, but she had a fractured collarbone, bruised ribs, and a moderate concussion. She was awake. She was asking for him. He was listed as her emergency contact. Owen set the phone down on the workbench. He picked it back up. He looked at his hand for a moment like it belonged to someone else. Then he turned the lamp off, pulled his jacket from the hook by the door, and drove to the hospital in the kind of quiet that is not peaceful at all. He found her in a room on the 4th floor, sitting up with her left arm in a sling and a bruise spreading from her cheekbone down the left side of her jaw. She had a paper cup of water she wasn't drinking. The television on the wall was muted. She looked at him when he came in, and her expression did something he didn't have a word for. Relief, but deeper than relief, with something else folded inside it. "You came fast," she said. Her voice was even, but he could hear the careful underneath it. "You're my emergency contact, apparently." She looked at the cup in her hand. "I was going to tell you." "When?" "When it came up naturally." Owen pulled a chair from against the wall and sat in it. The chair was the plastic institutional kind that existed in every hospital on earth, uniformly uncomfortable, and he settled into it like it was the only place he needed to be. "It came up," he said. Her mouth moved toward something that wasn't quite a smile, but was trying to be. She winced when it got there. He noticed her notice that he noticed, and she looked away toward the window, where the city outside was doing what November cities do, darkening early, lights coming on in blocks, a sky the color of an old bruise. "Is there anyone else I should call?" he asked. Her parents were in Accra. She had a sister in Edinburgh. He knew the facts of her life the way you know the facts of a place you have lived in long enough. "No," she said. "Just you." He stayed for 3 hours. They didn't talk about what it meant that she had listed him. They talked about the driver who had run the light, a 22-year-old who had been looking at his phone, a detail she delivered without anger, and he received without adding any. They talked about the reading chair she had ordered that was being delivered Thursday, and she was going to need someone to assemble it because she couldn't do it one-armed. He told her he knew a person. She told him his delivery was bad. He said he was off season. She laughed and immediately stopped because her ribs made her pay for it, and he sat forward in his chair and put his hand over hers without thinking about it, the way you move toward a flame that's suddenly too close, automatic and sure. She looked down at his hand. She didn't move hers. Owen. Yeah. Why did you drive here like the hospital was on fire? He thought about that. Outside, a cart squeaked past in the hallway. The fluorescent light above them hummed at a frequency that suited nothing. Because it was you, he said, simple and accurate and true in the way only simple things can be. She turned her hand over under his, so their palms were touching. Her fingers were cold from the paper cup. His were warm from the drive. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and it was the kind of nothing that is full of everything at once. A nurse came in at the 40-minute mark to check her vitals and asked Owen pleasantly if he was family. He opened his mouth. Nadia, without looking away from the ceiling, said yes. The nurse nodded and wrote something on her clipboard and left. Owen looked at the wall for a moment, then he looked at the floor. Then he looked at Nadia. She was still looking at the ceiling with the expression of a woman who has said exactly what she meant and has no intention of clarifying. Family, he said. Is that a question? I'm still processing. Take your time. She reached across with her good hand and handed him the untouched cup of water. Here, you look like you need this more than I do. He took it. The water was room temperature and faintly plastic tasting, which described most hospital water in his experience, and he drank it because it gave him something to do with his hands and his face while he processed the particular quality of that one word delivered from a hospital ceiling. She was discharged the following morning. He was there at 9 with his truck and a tray of coffee from the place on Clement that she liked, the one with the mismatched chairs and the handwritten chalkboard menu that had too many adjectives for a simple oat milk latte, charging prices that suggested the oats had been harvested by hand in a sustainable European meadow. She took hers with both hands around the cup, even though her left arm was in the sling, and she smelled it before she drank it the way she always did, a small private ritual he had seen 100 times and never once mentioned. The drive to her apartment was 20 minutes. She was quiet for most of it, watching the city go by, a woman walking a dog the size of a couch, a barber shop with a hand-painted sign, a fruit stand under a green awning still wet from last night's rain. He didn't fill the silence. He had learned a long time ago that Nadia's silences were not vacancies. They were occupied. You just couldn't always see with what. At a red light 3 blocks from her building, she said, "I listed you 2 years ago." He looked straight ahead. "Okay." "Right after Patrick. I needed to change it, obviously, and you were the only person I thought of without thinking." The light went green. He drove. "I'm glad it was me," he said. "I should have told you." "You're telling me now." She looked at him sideways. He kept his eyes on the road. There was a specific Nadia Osei look he had catalogued over 14 years, and this was one of the newer ones, only from the last year or so. It appeared when he said something she had been trying to say to herself and hadn't found the language for yet, he had learned not to meet it directly because meeting it directly required him to know what to do next, and he was still working on that part. He carried her bag up to her apartment. She stood in the kitchen with her sling while he put the kettle on because she couldn't do it one-armed without cursing at it. He had witnessed the phenomenon before with a heavy pot when her right wrist had been strained, and the profanity alone had been genuinely impressive. He found the mugs and the tea she liked, which was in a tin behind the coffee with a picture of a dog on it that she had never once explained. He made them both tea while she sat on the counter and watched him move around her kitchen the way you watch someone who has done something so many times they don't have to think about where things are. "You know this kitchen better than I do," she said. "You keep reorganizing the spice drawer." "It was disorganized. It was organized by frequency of use. It made perfect sense." She pointed at him. "That's not a system." It worked. She dropped her hand and looked at her tea. The kettle clicked off. The apartment went quiet except for the radiator doing its November knocking, the pipes adjusting to the cold outside. There was a blue curtain over the window above the sink that she had bought at a market last spring and he had helped her hang, and it moved slightly in the draft from the window's old seal. He poured the water. He carried both mugs to the counter and stood across from her, close enough that they were having the conversation with only a foot of tile between them. He had a thought, standing there, that he had probably been carrying around for longer than he wanted to admit, which was that he was always careful with Nadia. Not the way you're careful with something fragile. The way you're careful with something that matters so much that being clumsy with it is not a risk you're willing to take. He had been careful for so long that careful had started to feel like its own answer, the way stillness can feel like a decision when really it's just the thing you do instead of deciding. Sometimes careful is just fear with better manners. "I was scared," she said. last night, before you got there. I know. Not of being hurt. The ribs and the collarbone are just... they're things. They'll heal. She looked up. I was scared of being in that room before you arrived, of the gap between when they called you and when you walked through the door. Owen looked at her. The bruise on her jaw had deepened overnight to the color of a winter plum. Her hair was still slightly flattened from the hospital pillow on the left side. She was wearing the dark green sweater with the loose thread at the left cuff that she had never fixed, and she looked, in this specific light on this specific November morning, like the most familiar and most important thing he had ever stood this close to. "Nadia," he said, "don't say something careful." He set his mug down. 14 years. I know. I know what we've been. I was going to say I've known for a while. He paused. I just didn't know what to do with it. She tilted her head slightly. You could have started with showing up every time I needed someone, but I think you covered that part already. There was a moment where neither of them moved. The radiator knocked once. The blue curtain shifted. He reached over and tucked the loose thread at her cuff back against the sleeve, which accomplished nothing structurally, and she looked down at his hand doing it and then up at him, and she said quietly, "Owen, if you want to kiss me, just do it. I have been waiting a frankly embarrassing amount of time." He kissed her. She had one good arm, and she put it against his chest, not pulling him in, just anchoring herself there, and when he pulled back, she kept her forehead against his, and they were both quiet for a moment. The way you're quiet after something that was always true finally says itself out loud. "Your ribs," he said. "Are fine," she said. "Mostly." He laughed, and she laughed carefully, and the loose thread was still loose at her cuff, and the tea was going cold, and the radiator kept knocking, and the kitchen smelled like cedar from his jacket and the old pine of her floors, and neither of them moved for a long time. 2 days later, a man named Dermot, Nadia's former colleague and Patrick's mutual friend, appeared at her door with a card and a prepared speech about how Patrick had heard what happened and was deeply concerned and would love to talk when she was feeling better. He delivered this information to Owen, who had answered the door because Nadia was resting, and who received it the way he received most things that were not his business to feel strongly about, which was quietly, with his shoulder in the doorframe. Owen thanked him for the card. He said he would pass along the message. He said Nadia was doing well, and was resting and was not taking calls. Then, because Dermot seemed to be computing whether to push further, Owen said evenly, "She knows where Patrick is. If she wanted to talk to him, she would have listed him." He said it the way you state a weather fact. Dermot left. Owen closed the door and put the card on the kitchen counter, and said nothing about it to Nadia when she came out because there was nothing worth saying. She found the card an hour later. She read it. She put it in the recycling bin under the sink. She came and sat next to him on the couch where he was reading the manual for her thermostat, which had started making a sound neither of them could account for. She put her head on his shoulder carefully, on account of the collarbone, and said, "Dermot?" He said yes. She said, "What did you say to him?" He said he'd passed along the message. She lifted her head and looked at him, and he looked at his thermostat manual. She said, "Owen." He turned a page. She said, "What did you actually say to him?" He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she put her head back on his shoulder and said, "You're impossible." He said, "The thermostat makes that noise every 4 hours. It's just the heat exchanger calibrating." She said, That's not what impossible means." He said, "Derby, the manual is quite clear." He came back the following Thursday to assemble the reading chair. She supervised from the armchair she already owned, still in the sling, occasionally reading aloud unhelpful passages from the instruction booklet, in a tone that suggested they had been authored as a philosophical exercise rather than a practical guide. He ignored the booklet entirely and assembled the chair by geometry alone. It came out level and solid, and she sat in it that evening with her tea while he cleared the packaging, and she said, without looking up from the book she had already opened, "I ordered a second one, for that corner." She pointed, in case someone needed somewhere to sit. He looked at the corner. He looked at her. She was still looking at her book. "When did you order it?" She said, 3 months ago." He bent to gather the cardboard. He was smiling at the floor. "Good planning," he said. That winter he brought 3 restoration pieces into her apartment because his garage had a draft making the wood too brittle to work. She did not object. She did not suggest it was temporary. He eventually stopped calling it temporary himself. He kept the spice drawer organized by frequency of use, and she let him. And sometimes she reorganized it when he wasn't there, and sometimes she didn't, and neither of them ever made a policy about it. The following spring, he proposed in the kitchen on a Wednesday evening while she was sitting on the counter eating crackers from a sleeve and he was washing the pan from dinner. He dried his hands, took the ring he had been carrying in his jacket pocket for 11 days out of the small brass dish where she kept her spare keys. It had seemed like the right container, and held it up. She looked at it. She looked at him. He said, "I've been keeping it in the key dish." She said, "I know. I found it 9 days ago." He said, "Why didn't you say anything?" She said, "I was waiting to see how long you'd wait." He said, "I was working up to a speech." She said, "Don't." He put the ring on her finger, and she slid off the counter and stood with her arms around him, and she said quietly against his shoulder, "I listed you as my emergency contact because you're the person I reach for when everything else goes wrong. I just didn't know that's what I was saying." He kept his arms around her and said nothing, because some things are better received than answered. Outside, the spring light came through the window and caught the blue curtain, and the brass key dish sat empty on the counter, and the spice drawer was organized exactly the way it should be. What would you have done if you found out that someone you had known for 14 years had quietly put your name down as the first person they would call in an emergency and never once mentioned it? And have you ever been that close to something real for that long without knowing how to name it? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.